The day began like any other, the morning light filtering through half-drawn curtains, dust particles dancing in the beams. I had been putting off this renovation for months, maybe years, telling myself that door frames weren't urgent priorities. But here I was, finally, with a carpenter standing in my entryway, measuring tape in hand, eyes narrowed with professional scrutiny. There's something peculiarly intimate about having someone examine the spaces you move through every day. The carpenter, his name was Michael, ran his fingers along the worn wood, tracing years of scuffs and marks, the physical evidence of life happening. "This frame has seen a lot," he said, not looking at me, but at the wood, as if it were telling him stories I couldn't hear. The doorframe itself was nothing special, standard height, slightly warped on the right side where the house had settled over decades. It was painted white once, now yellowed with age and marked with pencil lines tracking the heights of children who had long since outgrown the ritual of standing straight against it, heels to the wall, eyes forward, waiting for the gentle pressure of a hand on their head and the scratch of pencil marking another year's growth. I hadn't thought much about door frames before, but watching Michael measure with such precision made me consider them differently. These humble architectural elements that we pass through countless times, thresholds between one space and another, between one moment and the next. Let me explain why door frames matter more than we realize. They're not just functional necessities, they're symbolic boundaries. In ancient cultures, doorways were sacred spaces, transitions requiring rituals and protections. Even today, we mark them. Think about the threshold a bride is carried over, the mezuzah in Jewish homes, or even the simple act of knocking before entering. Each doorway we pass through represents a choice, a movement from here to there, from now to next. And here was Michael, measuring mine, preparing to replace this worn portal with something new, something that would frame the next chapter of life in this house. As Michael worked, I noticed the methodical nature of his movements. There was nothing rushed or haphazard about the way he extended his tape measure, the way he marked measurements in a small notebook with a carpenter's pencil worn down to a nub. He measured once, then again, then a third time, muttering numbers under his breath. "An eighth of an inch matters," he said, catching me watching him. "Especially with old houses like this. They're not square anymore. They've lived too much to stay perfect." I found myself nodding, thinking about how true that was of people too. How we all become a little less square, a little more uniquely shaped by experience as we age. The tools of Michael's trade fascinated me. Simple instruments that had remained largely unchanged for centuries. The tape measure with its satisfying retraction, the pencil that left marks that could be erased but served their temporary purpose perfectly, the small level that determined what was true. There's something reassuring about tools that have withstood the test of time, that haven't been replaced by digital alternatives. The carpenter's tools are extensions of the human hand and eye, amplifying our ability to create and measure, but not replacing the fundamental human element of the craft. Michael's precision reminded me of something I'd almost forgotten, the value of getting things right the first time. In our world of quick fixes and replacements, there was something almost meditative about watching someone take the time to ensure accuracy. A door frame installed improperly would mean doors that never quite closed right, drafts in winter, sticking in summer humidity. The consequences of carelessness would persist daily, small irritations that compound over time. "A good carpenter measures twice and cuts once," Michael said, as if reading my thoughts. "Actually, I measure 3 times. Maybe that makes me overly cautious, but I've never had to apologize for a job done right." As the morning progressed, I found myself sharing more about the house, telling Michael stories about the marks on the doorframe, about the people who had passed through it. He listened while he worked, occasionally asking questions that showed he was genuinely interested, not just being polite. There's a particular kind of conversation that happens when someone is working in your space. Less direct than sitting face to face, somehow easier for sharing things you might not otherwise say. Perhaps it's because their attention is divided, or because the physical labor creates a buffer that makes emotional disclosure feel safer. It was around midday when something shifted in our interaction. Michael had finished measuring the doorframe and was making notes about the materials he'd need. He looked up suddenly, catching me in a moment of distraction. I'd been lost in thought, worrying about deadlines and obligations, my breath shallow and quick. "You breathing okay?" he asked, His brow furrowed slightly. The question surprised me, not what I expected from a carpenter. Fine, I said automatically, the way we do when someone asks how we are and we don't want to burden them with the truth. But Michael didn't look convinced. Mind if I try something? He asked, setting down his notebook. Before I could respond, he'd stood up and was standing in front of me, not quite in my personal space, but close enough that I noticed the smell of wood and coffee on him. Take a deep breath, he instructed, and something in his tone made me comply without question. I inhaled deeply, feeling my chest expand. Now hold it for a second, he said, watching me with professional interest, the same way he'd examined the doorframe earlier. And let it go slowly. I exhaled, feeling oddly self-conscious under his gaze. Just as I thought, he said, nodding as if confirming a suspicion. You're breathing from here. He tapped his upper chest. Instead of from here, his hand moved to his diaphragm. It's like trying to power your whole house with a backup generator. It works, but not efficiently. I stared at him, confused about this sudden shift from carpentry to breathing techniques. My wife's a respiratory therapist, he explained with a small smile. After 30 years of marriage, you pick things up, and I notice when people aren't breathing right. It affects everything, how you stand, how you feel, even how you make decisions. This unexpected turn in our interaction fascinated me. Here was this man who had come to measure wood and calculate angles, now measuring something far more personal, the very rhythm of my existence. Breathing is the most fundamental act of living, so automatic we rarely think about it. Yet here was Michael, bringing it into my conscious awareness, making me realize how disconnected I'd become from this essential function. Let me show you something, he said, and proceeded to demonstrate diaphragmatic breathing, the way his stomach expanded on the inhale rather than his chest rising. Try it, he encouraged, and I did, feeling somewhat awkward but also curious. The first breath felt strange, intentional in a way breathing shouldn't need to be. The second was easier. By the third, I noticed a slight lightheadedness, a pleasant sensation of more oxygen reaching my brain. That's it, Michael nodded approvingly. You'd be surprised how many people go through life never breathing properly. It's like having a car and never shifting out of first gear. There was no judgment in his voice, just the same matter-of-fact tone he'd used when discussing the doorframe's measurements. What struck me most was the parallel between the two acts of measurement, the doorframe and my breath. Both were assessments of space, one external and visible, the other internal and invisible. Both were concerned with flow, the movement of bodies through a house, the movement of air through a body. Both required attention to detail and an understanding of proper function. I found myself wondering how often we attend to the structures around us while neglecting the structures within us, how we can be so concerned with the straightness of a doorframe and so oblivious to the rhythm of our own breathing. The thing about doorframes, Michael said, returning to his notes, is that they need to be true even if the rest of the house isn't. They're reference points. If they're off, everything that passes through them is affected. He looked up at me. Breathing's like that too. It's a reference point. If it's off, everything else gets affected. Your posture, your stress levels, your sleep. I was struck by the wisdom in this observation, by how this carpenter had connected his craft to something so fundamental to human existence. There was a holistic understanding in his approach that transcended specialization. As Michael packed up his tools, promising to return with materials in a few days, I found myself standing differently in my own home, more aware of both the spaces around me and the space within me. The doorframe that had seemed so ordinary that morning now appeared as a significant marker, a boundary between rooms, but also between states of being. And my breath, that unconscious rhythm I'd taken for granted, now felt like something worthy of attention, a tool as important as any in Michael's carefully maintained collection. In the days that followed, I found myself paying attention to my breathing in moments of stress, remembering Michael's impromptu lesson. I noticed how often I held my breath when concentrating, how shallow my breathing became when anxious. I began to practice diaphragmatic breathing deliberately, setting reminders on my phone until it began to feel more natural. And I observed how this simple change affected other aspects of my life. My sleep improved, my thoughts seemed clearer, even my posture straightened almost without effort. When Michael returned to install the new doorframe, I told him about these changes. He smiled as he worked, pleased but not surprised. Bodies and buildings have a lot in common, he said, carefully positioning the new frame. Both need good foundations. Both need to be able to breathe. I watched as he ensured the frame was perfectly level, making tiny adjustments with shims and checking his work repeatedly. There was an artistry to his precision, a respect for both the materials and the purpose they would serve. The new doorframe, when finished, looked both familiar and strange. The same shape and size as the old one, but clean, unmarked by time and use. It represented possibility, a fresh start. I found myself running my fingers along the smooth wood, feeling its potential. It'll take on character with time, Michael said, watching me. The best frames do. They hold their shape, but show their history. I nodded, understanding that he was talking about more than wood and nails. As we said our goodbyes, Michael paused at the front door. Remember to breathe, he said, tapping his diaphragm with a smile. The house is only as healthy as its occupant. With that, he was gone, leaving me with a new door frame and a new awareness of my own internal architecture. I stood in the empty hallway, took a deep breath, a proper one, from the diaphragm, and felt the air fill me completely. Then I walked through the new door frame, crossing a threshold that felt significant in ways I couldn't fully articulate. In the weeks and months that followed, I found myself thinking often about that day, about the unexpected wisdom that had come with a simple home repair. I began to notice door frames everywhere I went, to think about what it meant to cross thresholds, to move from one space to another with intention rather than automatically. And I continued to pay attention to my breathing, to use it as an anchor in moments of stress or uncertainty, to remember that sometimes the most profound changes come from adjusting the most basic functions. The carpenter had come to measure my doorframe, but had ended up measuring something far more significant. In doing so, he had given me a gift, the awareness that the spaces we create and the ways we inhabit them, both physically and through our breath, are interconnected in ways we rarely acknowledge. Every time I walk through that doorframe now, I take a conscious breath, marking the transition from one space to another, from one moment to the next. And in that simple act, I find a kind of peace that no perfectly installed doorframe alone could provide. The peace that comes from being fully present in the spaces we inhabit, inside and out. Total _char_count, 13,147.